Good morning, everybody. Good to see good to see you all. My name is Josh Shanani, and I'd like to welcome you all to best practices for a successful sale. Couple of housekeeping items real quick before the get-go. One is please enter all questions in the chat box. We will have a portion of the presentation where we will do our best to go through those questions, and any questions that go unanswered, we will get back to you and answer them to the best of our ability. Second is that we're going to shy away this presentation from talking about potential tax strategies around sale. We will do a follow-up webinar specifically related to that. So with that in mind, I want to take a minute just to introduce myself. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Josh Shanani here. I'm a partner at Sachs. I run the firm's consumer and industrial products practice, formerly known as manufacturing distribution, and I am a member of the firm's executive committee. And I'm excited to be accompanied today by one of my partners and colleagues, Jerome Fusco, who runs our Sachs Capital Advisor practice. It's really a tremendous resource in general business, but also in the M&A world. So Jerome, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, appreciate it for having me.
Jerome, why don't you just give 30 seconds on your background, and for those folks who don't know who Sachs Capital Advisors is, maybe just give them a 30-second commercial.
Yeah, we started Sachs Capital Advisors in 2021, so a little over 3 years ago, as an extension of the firm's focus on properly servicing our target clients. So we focus on businesses with up to about $500 million in revenue, who have no institutional capital and who are either looking to grow via helping on a buy-side strategy by other firms, or companies looking for a succession plan, which is oftentimes accompanied by a sale of the business, or bringing in a new investment partner. And we focus on a number of verticals across industries. So again, very excited to be here. By way of background, I spent the bulk of my career in M&A, about 19 years. I've held positions at Citigroup and Bank of America in their global investment banking groups. And I also worked in Travelers Corporate Finance Group, doing insurance M&A and finance-related functions when I first started my career. So thank you for having me today.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome, Jerome. This is such a hot topic, and always relevant in terms of timing, as I would say a lot of the things we're going to discuss today are probably 50% of the questions that clients are posing on a day in, day out basis. There's so much activity, whether that be in the private equity world or in the strategic world, that everybody is considering whether or not it's time to really sell their business. So we're going to stay away today from a lot of the elementary, should I sell my business, should I not, and really cut to the meat and potatoes as to what's involved with a sale. We're going to first focus on trends and common misconceptions. We're going to talk about who are the frequent buyers. We're going to touch on some commonly asked questions from business owners during the sale process. We're going to open it up for a couple questions. We have those questions that were submitted ahead of time, and I'm going to monitor, as I said, the chat box as well during the course of the presentation. And then lastly, being a consumer industrial products connoisseur myself, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking specifically to some nuances related to that industry. So let's jump right into it. Jerome, when I think of current trends, I think the first question that comes to mind is, what is the current volume of deal activity that you're seeing out there?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there's two ways to think about it. One, from a high level macro point of view, the economy remains resilient. Obviously, we've seen a little bit of volatility over the summer, which is pretty typical, especially given lower volume and people are on vacation. So some of those things reflect in the market that you see lower volume trades. But overall, we've been pretty consistently healthy. Interest rates have been somewhat pesky and been a little bit questionable as to where they will go, and that's obviously critical because interest rates impact cost of funding and impact investor returns as it does on core businesses as well. But the volume we're seeing and interest, people coming from our middle market sector remains relatively resilient for a few factors. One, there's still a large group of opportunistic investors willing to pay a fair to premium market price. Two, there's still a lot of capital that has been sitting on the sidelines for the past few years that needs to get to work. And a lot of larger strategic investors who don't have any better use of the capital than to invest. You cross that with the dynamic of people wanting to retire, people wanting to start the proverbial clock, which we can get into a little bit later in terms of a succession plan. And then others just looking to monetize because they want to get off into other ventures has still made the M&A environment relatively healthy. It is not the largest volume environment we are seeing, but it's definitely picked up from some of the lulls of the last 12 to 18 months.
And just from your own professional expertise, we listen to the news and we hear about economic downturn and interest rates, of course. How does that affect the playing field? And is it just head trash, or is it real?
It's a good question. It's definitely had an impact. I don't know if it's, I wouldn't say deals have not gotten done because of it. I think deals have taken longer, and investors have really started to dig in and essentially have a full understanding of the financial picture because they're getting more pressure from their banks and just more time making sure that they are getting the investment decision right. So a lot of these things that you're seeing do have an impact. But if you look at the yield curve right now, it is inverted at the top end, which basically means that long-term rates are lower than short-term rates. So the view is that while borrowing might be a little expensive now, I can borrow now and potentially refinance later as part of my strategy. So I can take a little bit of the interest rate expense up front. The trickiness becomes if they stay long in perpetuity, how will that impact things? But for right now, the view is still that there'll be a full interest rate point cut in the coming month or so.
Yeah, and I think kind of to that point, staying with trends is how does that impact valuation, right? I think a lot of times people want to know, one, what's my business worth? Is it a multiple of EBITDA? Is it a multiple of top line? Has, you know, what are things that people should consider when they even think about what is my business worth and how that plays into what that exit strategy looks like?
Yeah, so each industry will have a general target benchmark or metric in which you form valuation off of. And on technology slash less profitable sides, less profitable businesses that are growing, you see a revenue multiple being applied. But in a lot of the core businesses that are more mature, so such as construction services, professional services, manufacturing and distribution, you see a traditional multiple applied to EBITDA. And what I would say is multiples and deals from our lens, remain relatively resistant and at a high price. Not necessarily the highest premium ones, but deals are definitely getting done still at very attractive multiples to sellers. What I would say is the unique part, that we see under the hood is we're seeing less and less the offers come in at that high point. So 3 or 4 years ago, we might have gotten 4 offers at that high point. Now we're getting two, which is still fine as long as your one or two is dedicated to getting a deal done. You might not necessarily have the strong backdrop to negotiate as heavily on certain other points in the deal,
Mhm.
knowing that you don't have 3 or 4 investors behind it, you might not be able to push demand as much. But we are still seeing deals getting done at very favorable valuations in multiple industries.
So you mentioned EBITDA. Maybe just give 30 seconds as to what is EBITDA from an investment banker standpoint. How do you look at it? How do you calculate it? And then what
Yeah.
is this concept that takes me from financial statement EBITDA to what we would call normalized EBITDA that is used in deals?
It's a great question because it comes up a lot. Like, why does everybody care about EBITDA? And the real reason is it is essentially a proxy for free cash flow. And if you think about the metric, it's your profits before you pay taxes, interest, and you back out depreciation and amortization, which are non-cash expenses. So it shows how much cash you're throwing to your bottom line before you have to pay interest or taxes. And that amount is what a bank will look at to see how much financial debt you can take on. And that's no different than if you were to have a rental property and say how much rents am I getting from the tenants after expenses, and what kind of interest expense can I bear on this house? And debt is used in every transaction, whether it's directly or indirectly on a corporate side. People are always cognizant of how much capacity they can get from the banks because it's better economic term to use other people's money and use debt than to straight finance off of your own balance sheet or use your own equity. It becomes more and more expensive, similar to buying a house. It allows you to expand on purchase price and oftentimes expand on the multiple.
Got it. And how
And
do
then,
I?
in terms of your question on going from what you might call stated EBITDA to what you see on your financials to what we go to market with, we make three different kinds of adjustments. One is normalization of one-time expenses. So very simply, let's say you outfitted your office with air conditioners and new computers in 2023. We would take that cost and add it back because that is a one-time thing that does not plan to happen every year. The other item too, kind of like bullet two to that, is professional services and other services that you may use to help things get online, that you may help to like install a new product line that again will not be recurring. We generally add those back. And then there's the other area, which personal expenses, fringe benefits. So things such as key life policies, any kind of business dinners that might be a dual purpose business, but under somebody else's ownership, you might not run through, and then the other personal automobile expenses. And there's a great gradation of what people run through the business just in a practical standpoint. So we spend a lot of time to really understand what that is. And then we get to what's called an adjusted EBITDA, and that EBITDA should represent the EBITDA in the financeable EBITDA in which the new buyer is looking at, because that's what they're buying and that's what they can expect to be delivered at the start or close of business.
And Jerome, just one more follow up there.
Sure.
Let's say I have a banner year, strong financials, really healthy EBITDA. Do I run to market and I'm able to market solely on that, or is there historical EBITDA, a 3-year average, a 4-year average, a 5-year average that gets considered when coming up with obviously valuation and consideration of multiple?
Yeah, our job as investment bankers is to do two things. One, get you the highest value, but two, push the most the most reliable and the most obtainable EBITDA that will recur in perpetuity or that will continue to go, and really the most defendable one. So we want to have a great defense. So if your business is growing, let's say you had a manufacturing firm and 2023 was a banner year, and you've added 3 new long-term clients and you've gotten a little bit more operational improvement. And then since your revenue has grown, your EBITDA margin has grown because some of your OpEx are fixed costs, and that increases your margin because it costs the same to run a $20 million revenue firm as it does to run a 31, and your EBITDA increases. That's defendable, and we go forward. If you had things like ERC credits or other like a one-time lumpy project or some kind of like one-time consulting fee that comes in, we do all we can to see like, is any of that repeatable? And in the case of things like ERC and other one-timers, clearly not. But if there are other potential for consulting projects, we try to make an adjustment for that going forward, and create a greenfield to show investors that, hey, with your help, we can go out and get more and more of these projects, and it can be a growth opportunity. The more and more things are contractually signed, the easier, the more credibility and the higher the multiple will be pushed on your business.
Right.
But we want to paint the best picture and accurate picture, and also upside case into how your business could potentially grow.
Perfect. Just kind of next trend, and I think you might have touched on it a little bit initially, but what's the size of the audience right now participating in the process?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in terms of like buyer universe, how many people are quote unquote participating in sale processes? We're seeing a large volume of investors growing, and that's really a few trends. One, there's more and more capital in the market, so there's more and more private equity and strategic investors out there, more family offices, and this is to be natural. So firms like KKR and Carlyle and BlackRock, who you might think of as large historic private equity firms, have had groups of people break off and start their own funds, and they're targeting lower middle market firms, and this has created more and more capital in the market from different sources. What I will say is the amount of bids we are getting has declined a little bit in terms of percentage wise. So while we're having a lot of people look and quote unquote take flyers on a number of businesses, once we get to the end and really drill in who wants to spend time, it has gone down. And reality is it's more expensive to do that once you start to put in bids and hire lawyers and hire bankers and hire other professionals and consultants to look at things. So people are being more and more selective. So we're still seeing a broad array of people looking at deals, but in order to move to the next step of deals, they really need to have a lot more conviction.
And with the amount of capital out there, are you seeing, with deals more cash up front, less earnouts, or that hasn't changed that kind of hasn't changed that strategy?
Yeah, I think the general structure, where two-thirds, anywhere from two-thirds to 85, 90% up front, and then some kind of contingent piece still exists on the most part. This has always been a very situational piece too, right? Like if the owners are in their late 80s and they've had a manufacturing firm for 50 years, and it's beat like a drum for the last 10 and it's slowly grown at 5, 6, 7%, then an earnout isn't as attractive or as appropriate. But if you're growing like a weed with a young management team who's excited and wants to stay on, it can be either an earnout or in a form of what's called rollover equity. So there's less strings attached and just more skin in the game. We push to get as much guaranteed cash, whether now or in the future, or guaranteed equity as possible. But sometimes, in order to stretch to a premium value, people will layer it in with an earnout.
Great. All right, let's go. Let's kind of change course and go to misconceptions. My first one is maybe one of my favorites is I know everyone who will invest in us.
Yeah, and just take a step back. I'm glad we did we decided to highlight some misconceptions. I thought it was important because we see a lot of webinars and conferences, and the misconception piece doesn't always get addressed, but there are a lot out there, so we want to take some time. So yeah, the the broad question of like, hey, we'll go meet with a prospect and they'll say, listen, we know everybody out there. Which in many cases they might know, kind of like the 5 to 10 most obvious buyers. But in nearly every industry, there's another subset of less obvious buyers, people trying to get in. Let's say you're in a strategic company that makes consumer packaged goods like food. Perhaps there's a group out of Nestle that just broke off and formed a capital group who you might not be aware of, and they're looking to invest heavily across different sectors. And those are things that we have discussions with frequently. People often say like, I know who will buy my business, and we go in very unbiasedly. Because there's so many things that can happen. One, new investors in the space. Two, the investor you thought was perfect might be distracted internally and not be able to do anything and have other projects that are working on not related to M&A. So we generally like to have owners keep a very open mind. On the converse, if there are people they say, not in a million years I would ever sell to that person, we ensure that we don't go anywhere near that firm, just to be respectful to our clients and to our process.
Yeah, and even just to add, I was just in the middle of a deal where there was an expectation of a certain buyer, and that buyer actually wound up getting bought by somebody else. And because of the nature and the size of the transaction, the funds were frozen, and their M&A activity, was limited during that period, which was a prime earning potential for the company that we had represented. So yeah, you're right. Expectations change on a daily basis, especially with all the consolidation in the market. Next one, buyer wants my real estate.
Yeah, great question. So generally, buyers do not want the real estate. While there are exceptions in different sectors are more open to it than others, buyers generally invest for the operating business. And if you take a step back and think about it, let's take a company like Coca-Cola, who operates lots of spaces across the United States, but generally does not invest in real estate. If you're an investor in Coca-Cola, you're investing because you feel consumer trends are positive, that you're able to open up a new brand portfolio, you think that there's positive trends within like a new demographic, or you're able to expand geography into other international territories. And let's say you execute on all that plan, but then there was a massive dip in the real estate, and then that impacted your valuation. The investors who are looking at middle market businesses are thinking the same thing. There's nothing wrong with owning the real estate. They're investing behind a base who wants to get returns based on your operating business and that industry. With that being said, what most nearly 95% of investors can do is have relationships with other real estate investors like Blackstone and other large realty companies, and who can help you out with a sale leaseback if you want to liquidate everything at close. And what that does is it allows the transaction to move smoothly. It gives you a fair market lease on your business, and allows you a potential stream of cash flows after you sold, which many times can be generational. And now you have hopefully a highly rated tenant that with well financing that's able to continue to pay the rent.
Yeah, it's really good. And just in addition to that, and we're going to talk about it later, is what happens with environmental and how does that get handled, especially in the manufacturing world. But another common misconception is the buyer will take on or assume all my debt as part of the deal.
Yeah, good question. The deals are generally done on what's called a cash-free, debt-free basis. So if you think about the multiples that people often express, those are done on what's called enterprise value. And the enterprise, just think of the business on its total value basis. So you think about that equal to a home value basis. And then the reason they take out the cash to debt, the cash and debt, is you keep your cash and you keep your debt and you pay that off at close. And that gets you to your equity value. So back to the home example, if you pay off your loan, that equals your equity in your home. Same thing in a business. The buyers are generally don't generally value a business any differently, whether there's a little bit of debt, no debt, or a significant amount of debt. They have a general value for the business based on a standalone basis, and it's up to agnostic to capital structure. So they will not generally not assume the debt, but they will not pay off your debt and then pay you enterprise value on top of that, because they would be double dipping. Now, often there are instances in which the buyer does assume debt because of the better rate on financing than they would potentially get. And that is a and but that is also considered part of that would come out of your check too. Now, if you do have a better rate on some of it, perhaps it allows us to negotiate other things in the deal, where hey, you're getting this sweetheart deal on financing because of our capital structure. We want X, Y, and Z back. So it can be beneficial if we're in a good standpoint and they're doing a deal in which they're purchasing the equity of the company. But generally, we think about things on a cash-free and debt-free basis.
Yeah, and I think a lot of times it plays very much into the end game question as to what comes in my pocket, right? So,
Of course, that's
you
the
know,
biggest question.
we always focus on the top line, and sometimes it takes time to get to the bottom line, but that is a big thing, especially if you're out very heavy on a line of credit, you're purchasing materials, inventory, things of that nature. That line of credit balance gets measured up until the date of the sale. So as you continue to run your business, and again, that's another thing we'll talk about later, that very much plays into it. Next one, Jerome, is that, is the buyer going to just lay off all my employees after the sale?
Yeah, that's probably the one that I've gotten the most, or that will always come up within the first two or three questions. Is the buyer going to come in and fire everybody? And that question is not unwarranted, because probably about 10, 15 years ago, there was a large push to expense reductions when people did deals. I will tell you, in the last 3 to 4 years, we've all seen the change in dynamic of hiring and finding quality employees. And investors think that way too. They're very seldom do they come in and make wholesale changes, or really in any of the deals we've done, any changes to personnel at all levels, not just the high levels. And even when there are larger layoffs in the company down the road, I've seen a longer string for people who've had their companies acquired just to maintain that culture and make sure that everybody knows that this is not a bad actor. As I mentioned earlier, there's more capital in the market. So a few things. One, if you get a bad reputation for being an acquirer that is a nightmare to work for and that has a bad culture and it's going to let everybody go, that becomes a challenge for somebody looking to be an attractive home for a seller. Two, as I mentioned, it's hard to find good talent. So even in the cases where there's duplicity in roles, so maybe what in operations or HR or finance, investors and buyers have gone out of their way to see are there other roles that they can put those people in, or just keeping a deeper bench in case something happens. So the phenomenon of retaining all the employees is very strong. So that we have not seen in almost any of our deals any layoffs, which has been a very good sign. Now, the converse to that is sometimes our sellers will say, well, if I'm doing this deal, I want to clean things up ahead of time, and this will give me a good excuse to do it. I've had some employees that I probably should have been a little bit more thoughtful about, or really I've had to have a discussion with. We don't ever recommend them to lay off people to juice returns or to show a higher number. But if there are things they do want to clean up, and they want to do that before a transaction, we encourage that, not just on the human side, but on all sides of the business.
That's really good. And last misconception to kind of wrap up this section is that as long as my financial records are in order, the legal paperwork, the HR, maybe some of the tax elections, things like that, those don't matter, right? We can just work that out, after the fact.
Yeah, it's a good question. You want to have your house in order as much as is practical and feasible, and at a reasonable expense, right? Like we have clients that you could redo every document you have and have everything in perfect order and have your financials fully audited and whatnot, but economically it doesn't make sense. We want things that make you look as strong as possible and also go off your timeline. If you're 3, 4 years away from a sale, which a lot of our clients are, you have plenty of time to look at things and not rush and implement new procedures and policies, which can also be a little bit more cost effective than overhauling everything at once. But if you're looking to go to market in 6 to 12 months, we will see like what needs to be done, and then what is a little bit more practically, and then what is a nice to have versus need to have for clients. So yeah, it's
Yeah, and Jerome, I guess, for those of us who have gone through due diligence or in the middle of it, there's no stone that goes unturned, right? I mean, they spend just as much time looking at the house as they do the financials in some cases.
Yeah, it's a good question, or a good point rather. So, we see diligence lists that at times are hundreds
Mile long.
or miles long, and sometimes, we laugh because the more seasoned the investor, the longer the diligence list, and you'll see things like, why are they asking that? So if something randomly popped up on a transaction like in 1999, there's a good chance it could still be on the diligence list. Like we'll get questions out of left field, and a lot of them are not applicable to our situation. But the seller will be like, why would they even ask that? And I'll say it probably popped up on a deal like 10 years ago, and they didn't see that first. Because that's a lot of times these diligence lists come from things people missed on previous deals, so they tend to get longer and longer.
Great. So let's kind of transition to the next point is, you know, if I look at the playing field today, you know, what does our universe of buyers look like? I think a lot of times we focus just on strategic or private equity, but obviously there's a lot more in play today.
Yeah, it's a good question. Generally, people think of the world in those two categories. So we have the strategic field, which, in terms of, just to put it very simply, are people who do what you do. right? So if you were thinking about back to our consumer product good example, if you're thinking about, you have a food company, if you're a manufacturer of foods, Nabisco, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, those would be what we call strategic buyers. And then on the other side, we have financial buyers, and that's private equity, family offices, and then other pools of capital that exist on people who want to take an investment. Now, just because they're pure and they're targeting a financial return. Now, the key to the financial buyers is that they oftentimes have a strategic angle. So you might have a group of people who came out of Coca-Cola or another similar firm, and like, okay, we have a very strong background in food, and this is where we're going to do a lot of work, and this is where we have expertise and we have operational connections and we can add value. So just because they're a financial buyer does not mean they do not have a strategic angle. While you have very large well, you have very large private equity firms like Carlyle and Apex who are in multiple different verticals. Oftentimes you'll see middle market private equity firms that focus in areas such as professional services. So they might focus on architects and engineering and accounting, and different kinds of asset management. Or you might have industrial focused ones who are doing manufacturers and distribution. And then you might have technology who focuses solely on tech-enabled services and SaaS-based businesses that have a high growth mode. So really, the investor universe is quite large. And in addition, when we run a process, we encourage sellers to speak to both. We also spend a exorbitant amount of time going overseas because European and Asian investors can be very good investors of business, and sometimes they might take a little bit longer than the traditional North American buyer. They can also be very effective and can also be a little bit more aggressive on price, especially if they want to expand into the US. So we encourage our sellers to speak to both. There's a different characteristics that can be more attractive to some than the other, and there can be more upside and more downside, and again, more preconceived notions with some versus other. But we spend a lot of our time educating sellers on the full investor universe and who owns who, because a lot of times people are surprised about how deep the ownerships go in some of these fields where you'll have somebody owning three or four of people in their segment, and they're unaware of. So it's definitely and this is expanding every day. One, on the strategic side, strategics are growing as well. So as they get more and more size and have tapped out on organic growth, they're looking at M&A. And as I discussed earlier, the private equity and family office space and financial sponsor space has really grown as more and more capital is being raised to focus on this.
Yeah, and Jerome, and this is kind of a shameless plug for you, but this is why you have to have a good investment banker, right? Because what your general expectation is of the universe versus the contacts that someone like you has, and the experience of industry is incredibly important. You have one shot to do this, right? You have one shot to sell your business, and you want to make sure that you reach as many possible opportunities as possible, right?
Yeah, you really have one shot, and we spend a lot of time up front asking about what your objectives are, and encouraging you to have an open mind. But if there are certain things that or parallels that fit very nicely with some versus the others, we will obviously take that into consideration. But to your point, you want to go as deep as possible, but you don't want to seem like you're going out to every single investor in the universe. You want to go to a very good targeted group, to be effective on time and to be effective on how I can push price to as high as possible. And to your point, you do only get one chance to do this, and having a large Rolodex like we do, and having different resources and having weekly, if not daily, discussions with all types of investors to make sure that we're doing the best justice by our clients, to make sure that we're in front of everybody possible, is really where we spend a lot of time.
Right. So that's a perfect transition, right? You talked about timeline, and that's probably one of the most commonly asked questions is how long does the process take from, initial solicitation to close?
Yeah, it's a good question because that is like, well, how long is this going to take? Is it like selling my house? Is it like selling a car? Is it going to take 6 years? And the question is, it depends always on a number of things. Once we sign an engagement letter and move forward, how quickly we can get information and synthesize it into materials that investors are used to seeing, will definitely be a large impact on how long it takes. The other impact will be how in order is the house, like how's the quality of information? Are we able to verify a lot of things? But let's assume that, as most businesses, we're able to get things in good working order relatively quickly. Deals generally, we tell people are going to take between 4 and 6 months, just to be conservative. And that's gotten a little bit more, that timeline has expanded over the past 4 years, for a number of reasons. Um, one, more due diligence, as I mentioned earlier, that came along with interest rates. Two, general, some of the hybrid working environments have definitely impacted things, especially. But to the counter to that, you're able to meet quicker given teams and whatnot. So that's been the helpful to it. But what I will say is generally from the time we sign an engagement letter, people generally know who their buyer is and what the approximate value or price is going to be within 10 weeks. So that part's exciting. But if you do the math, that means you have a lot of diligence and a lot of checking the box to do over, and legal work to do over kind of the back half of that, the next 10 to 12 weeks. And at times things do feel, especially up until closing, like little things are dragging along, but there are a lot of boxes to check and a lot of things to think about.
Yeah, good point. Talk to me about working capital. What is it typically, how it's calculated? And usually you see in a purchase agreement or a sale agreement, it says 90 days, 120 days. um just kind of walk me through the process of what it is, how it's calculated, why it's important, and what does excess or shortfall mean in the grand scheme of things.
Yeah. So working capital, I usually bring working capital up when somebody asks me, which quite frequently happens. So I keep all my AR, my accounts receivable, and my accounts payable. And the answer is no. In most transactions, and there's always instances where it's not the case, but for the most part, people buy you with what's called an adequate level of working capital to run the business. Think about this as renting a car and then bringing it with the same amount of gas. So the calculation is generally your accounts receivable and inventory less your accounts payable. As I mentioned earlier, things are done on a cash-free and debt-free basis. So your financial debt and your cash stays with you. So people will look at, typically about 12-month average of accounts receivable, and then take a 12-month average of your payables. And if you're a growing business, you might take a 3-month average if things have been really growing, or a 6-month average to show the real working capital need of the business. But the reason people generally use 12 months is to eliminate any seasonality. And what they'll do is, let's say your accounts receivable were $2 and your accounts payable were one. Well, you are expected to deliver the business with a net working capital number of $1. And at close, if you have $2 and $1, everything is fine. And the AP and the AR is transferred to the buyer. If you have $3 of AR and $1 of accounts payable, then you will get to keep an extra dollar, and vice versa. If you have $3 of AR and $3 of AP, you're expected to deliver another dollar. And we generally, this should not be a point where one side wins versus the other. The thought is that if I'm buying a business, I just want to make sure I can operate it. If I didn't have AR and AP inside the business, a new investor would have to fund payroll, fund all the liabilities up in, just like if you were to take it out and not collect, right? Same type of thing. So it is part of the principle of getting a business that is fully operating going forward.
Yeah, really good. Another question, two-part question. When do I hire a lawyer in the process? And is there a conflict of interest if my ordinary course of business, corporate attorney, um, should they be the same as my M&A attorney?
Yeah, good question. We encourage legal to come in as soon as possible, and at the very least before an LOI, and then later on to focus on the purchase agreement. Oftentimes, though, we not necessarily prefer, but we would appreciate a lawyer coming in to take a look through some of your diligence documents early on and getting ahead of any documents that might be that might have contracts, to really get our house in order. Articles of formation, looking at operating agreements with partners, reviewing employment agreements. So we like to have a lawyer early on, but we also want to be economically thoughtful. Like that, those are not free things to do, and those costs can add up, especially more and more issues you have. But the more and more issues you may have might be more of the reason to get things done. So we like to discuss like what we think this will cost and have an appropriate budget. I've had a lawyer for 10 years, and they've helped us with everything from our real estate loan to creating this contract. Should we use that person to do our M&A? And we generally say that you would not, if you broke your foot, you wouldn't go to your general physician, right? And then the question is, well, okay, fine. Can they both be involved? Well, back to that point, the surgeon would probably not want your general physician in the room because it could be distracting. Similar, similar with the M&A attorney versus your general versus a general counsel person, right? There's not going to be an instance in which somebody general counsel is going to win out on the on the M&A person given the experience. With that being said, there's definitely a partnership approach where they can help review legal agreements, and there's other things that might be in their purview that they can be helpful with. So this is not an isolationist approach. This is more just letting the right person take the reins on the certain things. The other important part about that is from an expense standpoint, you want to be thoughtful, and having two attorneys who have from different firms or different functions review the same document is going to add time, add cost to you, and could add potentially complexity.
Yeah, it's really good. Next question. Let's say I'm selling my business. I'm not really sure that I'm ready to hang it up yet. The buyer has said that they would love for me to stay in kind of some capacity. What can I expect as speaking as a business owner for my role to be going forward? Is there a number that people typically get paid, and how does what they get paid impact the overall value of the deal?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, in instances where you've either taken a very small salary and taken a large distribution, or you've taken a massive salary, there's usually an adjustment. And that adjustment is another piece that normalizes your EBITDA that we spoke about earlier. And we generally encourage people to tell us like what their plan is and what their ideal plan is, and then what is the appropriate number for somebody in your position. And we look at a couple things. One, most obvious, what are you willing to work for, and to be interested in? Two, what is the replacement value of your position? So let's say you're a general manager of a plant and that's what you do on a day-to-day basis. Like, none of us are going to work forever. And we should be thoughtful about like, okay, if Sally Smith were to leave, how much would it cost to rehire somebody approximately in that position? And then, every strategic investor might have a set corporate plan, like, well, this is how we compensate people, or private equity might say, like, this is generally how we like to compensate our owners. And we maybe make it a negotiation, but we generally go out to investors with a thought in our materials that shows you what we're modeling, quote unquote, for our financials, and and then a little bit some qualitative points as to what we like our role to be. That way we can have a thoughtful negotiation. You don't want to go out saying that your owner is going to make $10,000, but you also don't want to put a salary of $2 million either, to lower the value of the potential business.
Yeah, it's good. That's really good. All right, moving on. We've got a couple questions from the audience. The first one is, and you kind of mentioned it in the onset about PPP and ERC. One is how it impacts valuation, EBITDA, but obviously those are events that happen, 21, 22, whatever it might be. Who's responsible for that if any issues arise after the sale happens?
Yeah, so during a sale, people spend a lot of time on the three government programs, the PPP, the ERC, and the other select ones. And generally, most people have gotten forgiveness on the PPP loan, so that's fine. The ERC credits, people are still expecting credits here and there. And what we generally find is that investors will say, "Okay, we will carve those out such that if the money comes in, we will give it to you." But we're not going to give you a loan. We're not going to act as a lender for the government, just because there's still uncertainty whether or not that's going to get paid. The other key point is like, do I get credit for that? Well, you don't necessarily get credit in the sense of like we're not going to, you don't get you don't get the revenue impact from customers. But if there was temporary disruptions and we can prove it, we will make an adjustment, and saying like, hey, we would have taken this expense reduction in 2021 and 2022 had it not been for a government program. So we would have shown a lot more profitability. And then we bridge that to how we look in 23 and 24, and it makes sense and it shows a nice smooth backlog of things, a backlog of items. But the government programs have added, another level of complexity to deals. The
Right.
good news is with the SBA and with banks, we've done so many with these deals in place that we have a
Mhm.
general sense of not only how investors look at it, but also a large level of context to get some of the questions answered in the government if we need to, which
Right.
is helpful because governments don't always move as quick as we do.
Yeah, and that's a great point, right? So you think about, with the PPP, the SBA gave themselves a 6-year runway, and the IRS certainly there's a statute of limitations, and who knows what they'll do because they've been so slow to act with the program. Let's say that the IRS or the SBA comes in post close, right? And they find issue with either program or something else. Does that responsibility for that fall on the buyer, or does that revert back to the seller? And is there language in the agreement that protects both parties?
Yeah, so if you think about selling your business, think about the candy store. This candy store example. I sell my candy store on December 31st. On January 1st, it's the new buyer's responsibility for anything that happens going forward. And then retroactively before that, we have reps and warranties that says anything that comes back, such normal that even during normal course, that if it came when we owned it, we are responsible to take care of those things. So, for example, if somebody had an insurance claim, a slip and fall that you didn't tell somebody about, and they came back and said, "Hey, I fell in November in your store," well, we aren't up for that. Same thing with ERC. If they want to come back and challenge it, or say like, "Hey, you owe us X, Y, and Z," that is our responsibility. With that being said, the new buyer will often get the claim, have the claim come into them, and we will have language that forces them to work collectively with us, so that they don't just pay any claim. So if something comes back that we want to refute, we definitely have the chance to rebuttal it and to make sure that we're doing everything we can as if we still own the business, to make sure that we're not disadvantaged just because there's somebody who wants to get this claim off the books. Same thing with the ERC. Now, to be fair, if the government comes back, you might have less and less leg to stand on because they can be pretty firm on certain things. But there are periods, especially on the ERC money, if they're challenging it to support funding, which hopefully people who helped you get the ERC did some of the analysis. And a lot of those rules were relatively open and opaque. And despite shifting over time, if you applied and were grandfathered in under one set of rules, you can make the argument that you've changed the posts after we submitted.
Right. Absolutely. Another question. How important is it one way or the other for key employees to have employment agreements? And if they're not in place, is that a concern at the time of sale?
Yeah, so there's two ways to think about this. One, if you have key employment agreements existing, a new seller, a new investor will look to piggyback behind those and clearly say, hey, you've identified these people as key employees, and we'll look to make sure that our new employment agreement for them looks um, very similar to what they have. And if there's things in there that a new buyer can't do for whatever reason, maybe you have like paying an exorbitant amount for healthcare. We'll look to chew that up through salary, because there might be just rules and regulations that a larger investor might be more strict on than a smaller business. So that's one. Two, if you go through the process and say, hey, we don't have any key employee contracts, an investor or buyer might say, okay, well, we'd like to identify who are your next 3 or 4 key people because we want to make sure that we give them a signed contract, oftentimes with a retention bonus, to make sure that they stay on board. And that's a delicate situation as to how deep you want to go on that because you do want to take care of your people and have as many taken care of by the seller, especially the people that helped you grow and get to where you are as possible. But you also don't want the converse to happen where, okay, we went to Josh is a key employee of ours. We went to give Josh a contract. We told the seller, hey, he's a great employee. He's helped this business grow. He's going to be really excited about this. And then he says, I'm not signing with these people under no circumstance. Like I'm going out on my own. We don't
Right.
want to taint that lens and say like, hey, okay, so now we're losing this critical person. Should we be concerned? So it's definitely a delicate balance and one that, we might want to have discussions with people ahead of time and at least take their temperature to how they'd feel. But again, we want to also protect confidentiality. So it's tricky.
Yeah, really good. Really good points. Um, Kind of honing in on a couple things, kind of near and dear to my heart and my client base on the consumer and industrial product side is talk talk to me about obviously inventory, right? Is the biggest component here versus other industries. What in your minds are the biggest challenges, biggest obstacles when it comes to sale related to inventory? Is it existence? Is it costing? Um, what's your feel?
The biggest the biggest issue generally comes as what is the right level of inventory that you have? What is the most accurate one? So, there are times where owners have taken large liberties in writing down inventory over time, which can muddy the actual value, which can muddy your cost of goods sold and whatnot. So, really want to isolate upfront, like, okay, like how much control do you have of your inventory? Do you have a system? Like if you don't have a full warehouse management, costing system in place, perhaps you've kept counts. Because what will often happen is, and it really depends. Like if you're a manufacturer, it can muddy your cost of goods sold. With a distributor, it's a little bit easier to see because you have a defined product that you're selling and there's a markup. So you'll still have a good idea. An investor will still have a good idea on your gross profit. And then if you're a service company that just keeps inventory, that's more of an expense anyway over time
Mhm.
that goes on. So bringing it back to having accurate inventory and why that's critical is we might be selling a company and the owner says, hey, I have an extra 10 pallets more than I normally have. I want to get paid for that. And it's okay. We need to go and prove it though. Like while I believe you, I need to see over the last 2 years that at this time we are buying things at a higher price. And oftentimes we can prove that. But there might be times where people say, hey, I think I have $5 million of inventory. But really have no idea how to count it. And I haven't done an inventory count since the 70s. Well, those are areas that people are going to dig in on and if we can't prove anything we have to meet to some concession which might be an inventory count at a time, which is good for an investor because they'll have an idea of what there is today, but it hurts us because we weren't able to prove that, hey, we normally run with this level of inventory because there's just no way of knowing.
Right. That's good. The prior webinar we had was about making investments to infrastructure, warehouse, technology. With the focus on technology, um, you know, do you recommend, or is the conversation had? Someone may say, "Look, I need to make upgrades to my systems, warehouse management, ERP, whatever it might be." Um, is that something I do, or is that the buyer would do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it depends on the quantum of what you want to do. If you're making we generally encourage sellers to run their business as if a sale's not going to happen. With that being said, if you're about to implement $10 million worth of ERP and warehouse management software, and we know your seller uses a different software and a different package and is changing it anyway, I probably encourage you to not do that. While despite it might be, well, despite it might be an add back and we get full credit from it from the investor, it's probably money you do not need to spend. So sometimes if we're close on big technological issues and we're going through this process, I might say, hey, do what is necessary, but hold off on things that aren't critical, especially on the ERP side. Last year, we sold a business that was looking at going to a new ERP, and we said, listen, hold off. We think they'll probably be on the one that you're buying, but let's just hold off to make sure we're wait a couple months or a month or two and just see where this goes. And it was a good thing we did because the ERP was a different one anyway. And then there's just other small changes which we encourage you to continue to make. So if you're able to use whether it's AI or better data analytics in your business now, or have better cybersecurity practices to protect you from outside threats, we encourage you to make those what we call critical or necessary technology investments that are part of your day-to-day business as need be. But yeah, anything that's a material decision that we say like, hey, you'd have to take a couple nights of sleeping to think about this. Let's discuss it and see what the best plan of attack is.
Yeah, and I think it always comes back to good data and how credible, does it make you more credible to a buyer to have certain things in place? I guess that a lot of that depends on the buyer, and that's where, the investment banker comes in so much value. So I've got one more. I mean, I've got a long list, as you could imagine, but let's focus on one more, and then we can always come back together another time and do more in the CIP area. But this one comes up a lot. Obviously, I'm a distributor, I'm a manufacturer. My suppliers, my customers are my gold, right? I hold those close to the vest. Um, at some point in this process, I'm going to have to disclose who my top customers are, who my top vendors are. The buyer may even ask to speak to them to make sure that the business transitions upon sale. At what point does that happen, and what can I expect? And then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, it's good. It's a good point. And I'll take it a step back and just start with one of the most important things that we tell investors is, listen, we can't control what happens in the macro global environment. There can be something out of our control, out of every investor's control. Look at 2020, look at 1920. That happens where where there's just not a market to sell the business. What we can control or have a good amount of control on is confidentiality. And we go through sometimes exhaustive measures to keep things confidential, like using project names, making sure we're using teasers, making sure that we're trying to use a secondary email if your emails are monitored by other people in the organization. And one of the reasons we protect that is we don't want employees to know, we don't want customers to know, and we don't want vendors to know. But to segue to Josh's question, we want them to know before we announce it to the public because A, they've been very helpful to us. B, people don't like surprises, and C, they could be critical to the operation going forward. So it really depends on how critical each element is to the business. So if you're a residential firm or a firm that focuses on consumers and you don't have a quote unquote direct relationship with your investor, your customer, and what I mean by that is not that they don't follow you on social media, but that you're not calling like, hey, like Coca-Cola is not calling me to see if I need any Diet Cokes today, right? In that case, we use a measure of like who do we actually need to tell? So suppliers, and we generally like to tell people, call it, with in a fine timeline. If we're ready to close within the next week, try and tell our key people 4 days, 3 to 4 days before we announce, sometimes even tighter, because we also don't want them to tell anybody because they're not really bound by any confidentiality agreements. We might have them say it, but there's no real repercussion that we can tell one customer or one client or one supplier not to tell the other. But we try to do the best we can. With that being said, now if a key supplier or a key customer is a material part of your business, or on the supplier side, gives you out of market terms where you're making an extra 20% margin over your competitors that they would normally offer somebody, we might have to get them under the hood early to make sure that this will continue after, or if they're comfortable with the buyer, which gives them a little bit of leverage clearly, but also like if you're in the investor seat, you want to make sure that these things continue because it could be integral to the cash flow. So it's a great question, and along with other key stakeholders too, like insurance brokers, accountants, key real estate people, other vendors who you've had long-standing relationships with. We do want to get ahead. We do want to get ahead of that, but but not too much where sensitive information could leak. So yeah, thank you, Josh, for today.
Jerome, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for all your insight. I encourage everybody on this call to reach out to us as questions come up, and we'll see Jerome again on November 1st at our Consumer and Industrial Products Conference. November 1st, American Dream Mall, East Rutherford. It's going to be real exciting, and it's going to be a culmination of a lot of the discussions that we've been having. If you remember last month, we met with John and Nile on AI and warehouse automation. Today, we're talking about M&A, and in a couple weeks from now, we're going to be speaking with more folks regarding all things technology, keeping your data safe in terms of cybersecurity, what technology infrastructure looks like, the importance of good ERP and good data as it relates to the overall operation. So again, Jerome, want to thank you. See you November 1st, and we'll be in touch. Thank you, everybody. A recording of this will be available in the next couple days, so watch your inbox for that. Thanks so much, Jerome.
Thank you.
You're welcome.